Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Critical Care, which is episode 5 of season 7 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my Patreon user polls. The video to win my latest Patreon poll is the episode Critical Care. So Critical Care is the episode in which the doctor's program is stolen by a thief who sells it to a society who uses it for medical purposes, but the society's medical system is extremely flawed, favoring those with wealth and power and neglecting those without, and the doctor tries to help those who need the help, and in doing so he's punished, and some of his patients who he's grown attached to dies. So as a last resort, the doctor abducts the hospital administrator and threatens to kill him unless he changes the system to allow his patients to live. This works, and then Voyager finds the doctor in time to bring him back on the ship. So before I get into this episode, let me first address the B plot of the episode, because I think the B plot is the framing device of the episode, because the episode begins with the doctor already at the strange hospital, which is a decision. I don't know. I don't like when episodes structure themselves like that, where we basically jump in halfway through the story, because I always feel really disconnected from what was going on. Now, they do catch us up through dialogue and whatnot of what had happened and how the doctor just so happened to be there. We don't actually go back in time and get any scenes that take place before this, so we're only told what happened before this through dialogue, even though by all means we're starting halfway through the story, because the doctor's program had already been abducted. It had already been brought to this other world. And as a viewer, I find that very disorientating. It makes it harder for me to get into the episode, to latch on to what's going on, because I always feel like I'm missing something. Now, the reason why I want to start with the B story in regards to that is because I can see why they did skip over, because it seemed the scenes what happened before the episode started was pretty boring and by the numbers, but that's because the framing device of the episode and the B story is very boring, cliche, and by the numbers, and not very interesting. And basically, to be real and to be, to the episode, the only reason this plot exists is to have an excuse for the doctor to be working at this hospital that has a fucked up medical system, which is really what the episode is about. The episode's really a critique of America's medical system, but that's, I'll get into that a bit later. But basically, that's the whole point of the episode. That's why they want to have an episode where they can critique the American medical system, and where the doctor has to deal with uptype administrators, but of course that wouldn't work in his setting on Voyager, so they had to put him in an alien setting. So they have to come up with some BS excuse to get him there. So in this case, the BS excuse they come up with is a thief came on Voyager. He pretended to be sick, or got sick from Neelix's really spicy cooking, and went to sickbay and learned about the doctor, and decided to steal the doctor in his program and replace him with the backup program. And then he went and sold it to this, other hospital, so that the episode could have the plot that the writers wanted to have. So, if the chronological order of this episode is to be believed, now you could always make up the BS excuse people always use for Game of Thrones, that the scenes we're shown are actually out of order. But if it is to be believed in chronological order, then it took him a long time to figure out that the doctor was gone. And it does seem like it, because we're shown Gar, who's the name of the thief, we're shown him selling the doctor to this alien world, And then we're shown Harry Kim and Tom Paris figuring out that the doctor is gone, and this is some like rudimentary training program in his place because he's lost all personality. It's just like, please state the nature of the medical emergency, whatever. So unless we're shown scenes incredibly out of order, it took them a long fucking time to figure this out. I mean, did no one have any, interaction with the doctor? And you figure, like, for Gar to leave Voyager and travel to this world, and apparently he's had a few stops on the way, and to sell the doctor, that it had to take at the very least, 1 full day. I mean, that's being generous. It could have taken him like 3 or 4 days. So really, it took like that long for fucking Tom Paris or anyone on board the ship to interact with the doctor. I don't believe that. Now, as far as the excuse of, we're just showing the scene out of chronological order, I hate that excuse. I think that's a bullshit excuse too, and I never like when people try to use it. It's just an excuse for bad writing. They just don't give a fuck. It's because the whole B story is just an excuse for to get the doctor where they want the doctor to be, so they could do this preachy episode that critiques the American medical system. Now, the B story itself, they continue on with this story where Neelix are trying to capture Guard, and they go from place to place to place to try to find him, which is kind of boring. The only good thing to come out of this storyline is when this woman who has the hots for Gar is like, says to Janeway, is like, oh, you just won him for yourself. And Janeway grabs Tuvok's hand. It's like, no, I'm already spoken for. And Tuvok looks so uncomfortable, but he has to be like, yes, of course, and go along with it. That was actually funny, but other than that, this B plot was seen entirely useless. Alright, so it goes on and them trying to fight Gar, which is a waste of time, and eventually they do, and they finally abduct him, not abduct him, but arrest him is probably a better word, because he's a criminal, and he won't admit to what he did, and he won't admit to where the doctor is until Neelix kind of tricks him. And again, this scene was a passable scene where, Tuvok threatened to mind meld, but then Neelix came in and like tricked him by saying he poisoned his food when really it wasn't, and Tuvok was like, Mr. Neelix, this is not, ethical tactics. And then Neelix rightfully says to him, didn't I hear you threaten a mind meld just now? Like, that was a great line. I didn't like that, and I thought this was good interaction between Neelix and Tuvok, something that's kind of rare for season 7. But other than that, the whole thing about, like, Neil, because they just did an episode in season 6 too about Tom and Neelix feeling like they lost their game or whatever, or and they got conned too easily, and now we're kind of rehashing that with Neelix feeling that he got conned by this guy too easily. So this whole storyline was just, it didn't put any effort into it. As I said, it was just an excuse to frame the episode. It was just framing work for the episode, and so they probably could have just done without it and said, oh, the doctor magically appears at this world, and left it at that, because this is essentially what they did anyway. So now let me get into the A plot, which I actually do really like the A plot of this episode, which is why I do overall think of this episode, put it in high esteem, because I do very much appreciate the commentary this episode makes, but also I think it's a very good character story for the Doctor, and I think Robert Picardo does a great job in this role. And it's like, in the way the story unfolds, the events of the story is really well paced and well plotted out, because they first establish what this kind of hospital is. They establish the administrator and how he cares more about people who quote unquote benefit society more than those who may not necessarily benefit society. and how the doctor's just trying to save lives. And they also do a good job introducing and developing characters like Dr. Fuji, the doctor who works in the Code Red, so the place for the workers and the poor people who society doesn't give a shit about, and Tebis, the patient who has a terminal illness that could easily be treated, but the treatment's being withheld because he isn't seen as necessary to society. So they do a really good job of introducing these characters and building the rapport between them and the doctor that you absolutely do really buy, and you buy the doctor's connection to him. And then when the doctor gets sent to level blue, which is supposed to be the prestigious place, but he finds that all the patients there are perfectly healthy, and the medicine that these other patients need for survival is being withheld so that they could treat people, the rich or the people who are in positions of prestige or power. They can give them the medicine that they don't actually really need. It's just supposed to prolong their lives a bit longer. So it's a really broken, fucked up system. The doctor, of course, is railing against it, but the administrator the whole time argues that it's benefiting society. And basically, the administrator, when you get down to his arguments, it's basically eugenics. And the doctor calls him out on it, and he denies it, but I think the doctor's absolutely correct that the administrator is basically purposely weeding out those less desirable, those seen as the worker class, and kind of weeding them out and focusing more on the rich and the powerful and the prestigious, and kind of doesn't care. And so if the other people who don't benefit society that much die, well, who gives a shit, as long as the good ones, the people who control the agricultural system or stuff like that, the higher up people of power, as long as they're healthy, who gives a fuck about everyone else? So yeah, it's basically eugenics. And it's a really fucked up system. There's an interesting dynamic too in this episode, is that the administrator is actually a different alien than the one from the world they're living in, and he was hired by this world, who apparently the world was falling apart and in economic and environmental upheaval, and they brought him in to sort of solve things. And I suppose they is focusing more on the medical area of things, but he's basically doing what he thinks is not best medical treatment to save lives. He's doing what he thinks will save this society, but of course the way he's doing it is basically eugenics. And so the doctor of course fights against this as much as possible, and he's actually very clever and getting the help of the other doctor by kind of pointing out just how flawed this system is, saying, oh, if we don't request this medicine now, then we're not going to get it later when we need it. And he kind of gets the other doctors on board because of that. And so, but when he tries to sneak behind, administrator's back and give and because he thinks he's found the way to permanently reallocate that medicine from the rich area down to the poorer area where the people actually need it to survive on a permanent basis. But of course, he gets caught by the administrator, who just lets his patient, Tebis, who the doctors come a bit close to, can see was a smart, bright young man, but society wasn't even giving him a chance to move up. It's like the poor keep getting poorer, that kind of mentality. And he dies, and so the doctor is deeply affected by this, and all the other patients that he was treating are being sent home, which means they'll all die too. And so the doctor takes extreme measures and poisons the hospital administrator, and fools the computer to make them think that he is one of the poor patients in Code Red. And so all you have to do is move all the Code Red patients up to Code Blue to give them the medicine that they need, and not Code Red, level Red, whatever it is. But anyway, all you need to do is do that, and you'll survive as well. So yeah, and it's funny because when they brought in the level Blue doctor, and the administrator thought, he'd totally be on his side, but he wasn't. He actually sided with the doctor because the doctor already pointed out how flawed the system was, basically. And so he gives up, And that's when, Chakotay and whatnot come to retrieve the Doctor. So that was a very powerful character story for the Doctor, and I thought it was elicited very well. Now, the ending is a bit hard. You gotta buy into the whole episodic nature of Voyager, where, everything's fine, happily ever after, but it's not really realistic. You think that once the administrator's life is safe, he'll probably renege on the deal, unless, of course, these aliens decide to fire him, which they should, because the Doctor kind of showed them the folly of his system. But then again, they've been going by a system for who knows how long, so you think that's kind of ingrained to them. So it's hard for me to buy that they would fire him, and it's harder for me to buy that he would simply abide by the agreement that was made under duress, and then he would go back and then let all the patients die and go back to doing his very fucked up system. But then again, this is episodic Voyager, because Voyager, especially in season 7, studio producers, no serialization, none! So we're meant to just believe everything is happily ever after, because that's what these stupid producers think. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt with this style of episodic television. So, we're led to believe they live happily ever after, but realistically, I wouldn't think that would be the case. But hey, the Doctor always right, whatever. But there's a little scene at the end that I really love, where 7 of 9 encounters the Doctor, and the Doctor gives her an exam, and then he asks her to give him an exam, or to, look at his program and his files to make sure it wasn't compromised in some fashion, because he realized that he, tried to kill someone, and very well, could have murdered a man, which would seem to go against his ethical programming. And so he asked Seven to examine his programming, and she says, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing wrong with your program. You're fine. I must give you a clean bill of health." And that's where the episode ends. And I think that's a really, really powerful ending for the episode, because the fact of the matter is, there was nothing wrong with the Doctor's program, because the Doctor actually was being ethical. He actually was in the right to threaten to murder that man, because that man would have murdered countless, at least at the moment it was like 20 or 30 people at the least, but he would have murdered way more, and arguably has murdered hundreds, possibly even thousands of people by using his really fucked up system, which favors, the rich and powerful over the worker class, and also keeps the worker class poor and makes it impossible for them to move up anymore. So, the Doctor totally did the right thing, even though, as I said, I have doubts on whether or not the Doctor's solution would stick, even though the episode wants us to believe it does, but whatever. He still did the right thing, and that's the whole point, because it seemed, and that's why it was such a great character beat for the Doctor, because he couldn't believe, especially looking back in retrospect, that he would behave in such a manner, that he would actually threaten to kill someone, purposely poison someone, because it would seem to be immoral, it would seem to go against his ethical behavior, but he was put in this extreme scenario where he was left with impossible choices, and he actually chose the most ethical option of what he had available, that he saved those lives, those 20 and 30 people who were in imminent danger because of one deranged hospital administrator. And so that was a powerful ending, and I really, really loved it. Now, as I mentioned before, this episode is very blatant in its a social commentary, and if you're one of those people who's like, "Oh, keep my politics out of Star Trek," which is a ridiculous thing, because Star Trek has always been really laced with left-wing political ideology in messaging, and it's integrated into the very soul of all Star Trek shows. So if you're one of those people who deny that fact, then maybe this is a time for you to stop watching that video, because yes, this episode has a very blatant, in fact, the political message behind this episode is just as hit you over the head blatant as, say, episodes like Let That Be Your Last Battlefield or Past Tense. Very obvious, and they make no attempt to hide it or even camouflage it a bit. It's right out there, smack you on the head as you watch this episode. It is a very obvious critique of the American medical system. Now, some people might argue that it's not a completely accurate analogy, and I could see that the most vulnerable place that people would point out to right away is the fact that this hospital administrator was letting people die and withholding medicine that could save their lives, because that was the first thing that people would argue against, who were like, well, even in the American system, they don't purposely let people die. They don't leave people on the operating table. They don't withhold medical treatment just because they don't have insurance or they can't afford it. Now, that is technically true, but there are a lot of caveats to that statement, so much so where I don't think it even makes a difference. That I don't think, the way they depicted in this episode as they outright kill the guys effectively isn't that much different from the American system, even though that technically it's different, but there's so many caveats to that. It's basically the same thing. Now, many caveats would be like, well, if it is experimental or rare or expensive treatment, then yes, they will, even if you are insured, by the way, they will withhold that treatment that could save your lives and you would die from it. Especially if you're not insured. Even if you are insured, insurance might find loopholes to prevent you from getting this experimental or expensive treatment. And also, if it's not experimental or rare and it's something that they will treat you with if you're not properly insured, or if you're not insured at all, then you will have crippling debt for the rest of your lives that will affect you and your family will live in squalor and debt for the rest of their lives, basically, just to get the life-saving treatment that you deserve. In fact, I've heard stories of some people who purposely committed suicide or let themselves die rather than leave their family with this crippling debt that would haunt them for decades. So, yes, technically they wouldn't leave you on the table to die, but hey, they're just going to leave you and your family with crippling debt for decades to come. That's not really much better. That's not, well, at least we're not letting you die. No, that's a huge caveat to that. And there have been cases of some homeless people or people without insurance that have died because they didn't take them to the nearest hospital because the nearest hospital wouldn't accept them. They only accept those with certain insurance. Or sometimes if they're homeless with no relatives, they have to go to like free clinics or whatever. Main hospitals won't take them. And so even though the main hospital is a lot closer, it could have saved their lives, they go out of their way to take them to these other hospitals that are special, that take people with no money and no insurance, and they die on the way. Where if they were taken to the closest hospital, they would have survived. So that happens as well. So there's so many caveats to this where I think this pointing out that is not necessarily the case is essentially pointless. Because yes, an episode of Voyager is going to simplify things. They're not going to say like, oh, we got to take them to this other hospital because they don't have insurance. No, it's an analogy. They're going to simplify it, be like, well, his TC isn't high enough, so we're not going to give him the medicine. Well, they wouldn't leave them to die on the table, except they kind of would in some circumstances. So I would argue that this analogy is, in fact, accurate. If anyone tried to say that wasn't the case, because essentially it is. Even though, there's more complicated caveats to that, essentially it is that bad. Now, yes, this is particularly critiquing the American medical system because pretty much every other developed country in the world provides free healthcare for its citizens. I remember watching this video once from someone who was arguing against this in the Canadian system of free healthcare, being like, oh well, of course healthcare costs money. What kind of these freeloader idiots think they can get shit that actually costs money for free? Those anyway, that is such a stupid argument. That's such a ridiculous argument. You know what else costs money? Highways, bridges, roads. They cost a lot of fucking money. What else costs money? Fire departments cost a lot of money. You think that all that equipment they use to put out fires is cheap? Schools, of course, that's another problem because schools are severely underfunded in the U.S., but that's another topic. Libraries cost money, of course, granted not as much money, but what's more important to ensure that their citizens have books to read, like they can read the latest John Grisham novel, or is it important to ensure that the population doesn't die from a disease that could be easily cured? And of course, this topic has become even more relevant during the pandemic, as the pandemic in America was worsened than most developed countries in the world because of the healthcare system being so broken. And so I think this episode makes very poignant, very powerful, and very accurate commentary on the follies of the American medical system, because it essentially boils down the American medical system to what it is. It favors the rich and those that society deem more acceptable or more productive to society over those worker class who it neglects and deems as less important to save, not as important to save, who really cares about them. If they want to if they wanted the medication, they wanted the procedures they needed to live, they should have worked harder. They should have been born into wealth. They should have been more important to society. It's their fault. Fuck them. That is the mindset that this administrator in this episode has, and that definitely is the essential mindset of the American medical system. So I think this episode is completely accurate. It is completely powerful and completely poignant, and that's why I like it so much. And it's sometimes people complain when Star Trek gets preachy, but I don't know. I think there's been a couple episodes where I thought their preachiness kind of sucked, but here in episodes like this one and the other two I mentioned, let that be your last battlefield, and Past Tense, I love the preachiness. The preachiness really works because it's a message, it's commentary that really needs to be said, that's actually really important, and it does it in a powerful and entertaining way, and that's kind of my favorite kind of storytelling. Anyway, my rating for Critical Care out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. Now, I did really, really enjoy this episode. I thought it had powerful commentary about the American medical system. Commentary I 100% agree with, and I think was pretty accurate. And as I said, it was a great character story for the doctor. It showed him struggling with, in this impossible situation, him basically threatening to kill someone. And in fact, he was doing the right thing. But why not give this episode a 9 or 10, you may ask? Well, as I said, the framing device, the whole purpose of this episode was really weak sauce. It was just like an excuse to put this doctor in a situation so they could have this episode that makes commentary. And they didn't really put any effort into how that happened. And of course, episodic television, there's no long-term consequences for the doctor's character. And, we're expected to believe that everything lives happily ever after a doctor leaves. In reality, that's probably not very realistic. So, also, the B plot was sucked. And it was kind of boring. Just, other than a few humorous moments, it was kind of dumb. So, that's why I only give this an 8, not a 9 out of 10. But it was still a really good episode, and I still really appreciate it. Definitely one of the better ones of season 7. Season that I don't care for overall. So yeah, it was definitely one of the highlights of season 7 for sure. So anyway, that is it for my review of Critical Care. Be sure to check out my channel as I continue to do many more Star Trek videos and covering many other shows such as Star Wars, Clone Wars, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.